You guys, welcome to another episode of Soft Rebellion. My name is Ndatu, and thank you so much for joining me. So, I've been thinking about the concept of time and space and consciousness. Now, I know this sounds very airy-fairy and almost philosophical or like up there in the clouds, but bear with me and I hope you can follow my logic and trail of thought. I've really been thinking about the construct of time, right? How we understand it is that time has passed and time is present currently and time is yet to come or in future. So we understand time in those three dimensions. But I've recently been toying with the idea that time is right now. It's this current moment, it's in the present. And everything else exists within this present moment, and the reason I've been thinking about this is in relation to consciousness as well. Like, I was talking to an ex-talking stage of mine. On TikTok, I called him Buji Panzula. He's turned friend now. And I was talking about how I wish I didn't exist inside my body. Not that there's anything wrong with my body, but I just find, at least on that specific day, I found the material condition of our existence to be so limiting. And by that I mean, it's easy for people to see the external, the physical, and make assumptions about who I am, or to listen to what I say and make judgments about the type of person I am. And I know it's weird saying this because, yes, I'm saying what I'm saying and I mean what I say. I'm deliberate in my speech, but I also find speech to be quite limiting in my expression. I don't yet have the language to express entirely what I mean and who I am, and therefore I feel people's understanding and experience of me is limited to just the few words in my vocabulary that I have, or to the level of their comprehension. You get me? And yet, if we didn't exist in these physical bodies, can you imagine what that experience would be like? I said to a friend of mine earlier, I think it's what I imagine freedom to feel like, for someone to see your essence with no physical limitations, no conceptualization of the physical capsule. You get me? Like, I just feel, can you imagine, like, if we're just floating spirits, if our existence was only spiritual and not physical? I think the idea of binaries wouldn't exist. Like the idea of gender, for instance, of race, which is a social construct. We've talked about this. The idea of sexuality, I think, wouldn't exist because we would just be spiritual beings. You wouldn't categorize someone as male or female, white or black, straight or whatever. And I know these kind of ideas are dangerous, and these are the kind of ideas that get people killed in other countries. You know what I mean? People get jailed for talking about these things. And this has been the case, in history as well. If you think about the social order of things and how people would, almost theorize identity and many other concepts in society, some would literally get jailed, and murdered. Religion is one example of such dangerous ideas that people would be killed for. And the reason I was also thinking about this, in relation to our consciousness, is how I feel like people are limited in terms of experiencing the world in its entirety because we're so accustomed to being fed other people's ideas, other people's thoughts of what is and what isn't, right? What is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, what is the norm and what is a perversion, such that we never really have time to think for ourselves, to feel for ourselves. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine today, and I thought, when I woke up this morning, my first instinct, as soon as I opened my eyes, my first instinct was to reach for my phone and scroll through social media. TikTok is now my preferred platform, which I used to judge myself for, but I've gotten, so accustomed to it, and it is addictive. But you end up doom scrolling if you don't just, stumble upon someone else's video, usually charged, and very energetic, and they would be talking about a concept, and you start to internalize those things. Before you know it, they have infiltrated your own thoughts, and I was thinking about how much of my thoughts are mine, they actually belong to mine, and how much of my dreams and desires are mine. Someone was also talking about how everyone now has the same apartment, the same kind of aesthetic, and I don't think that's by coincidence. That's by design. We're all being influenced all the time. Like there's a war on our attention span, and there was an article I read about an interview with, Netflix, and they were talking about how their biggest challenge, their biggest threat to their growth was sleep. Can you imagine a world where sleep is a weakness that corporations are trying to do away with? Something that they are succeeding in, by the way, because how many times do we sit on social media doom scrolling even though we are fatigued, but because we just can't remove these devices out of our hands, we continue to scroll and scroll and scroll. If that's the case, and the algorithm is pushing content that our brains, are responding to, that we're interested in, how much of our thoughts, and our dreams and visions end up being our own, or end up being influenced by someone else's agenda? How much propaganda do we internalize as how we should be? You get me? So I think if we spend time in silence or grounded in our own thoughts, free of external influence, we could actually, begin to imagine a world of limitless possibilities, a world where the material condition wasn't the only experience, wasn't the only human experience, a world where intuition and interconnectedness and the divine exist. It is fact that there's certain animal species that have senses that as humans we can't even begin to fathom. Scientists talk about dogs being able to smell a cancer or cancerous cells before they progress, which has assisted in early diagnosis. They talk about dogs even, the same species, being able to hear frequencies that just aren't heard of to the human ear. You know what I mean? Sight as well. There's bats that can see in the dark, something that we aren't accustomed to. And those are just some of the physical limitations that our bodies constrain us to. But imagine if then we didn't exist in these physical bodies. Now, I'm not advocating for everyone to die, but I think it is possible for us to tap into some of these frequencies that we aren't accustomed to if we listen and if we're grounded. And I've really been finding myself feeling more grounded. I mean, at home, my mom has always said that Percy, my sister, and Usne, my other sister, and myself, we've always been gifted, much like her. She comes from a line of sangomas or traditional healers. Since I've got an international audience, hello. So it's important that I interpret. So my mom comes from a line of traditional healers. Her dad was a well-known traditional healer, very powerful, and he could sense things. He would dream about people and he would know that they were plotting evil against him. It was just a gift. And my mom has that, right? My other sister also has this. I, to a certain extent, have a similar gift, but I've shied away from it because it can be quite scary. Sometimes you see random moments, but other times you see scary things. Like I had I want to say an epiphany, but I knew that my grandmother was going to pass away. And I remember, speaking to a church leader about this. And I knew exactly, the condition from which she would pass on. And I was so scared and I didn't know what to do. I told the church leader and all they told me was that I should pray against it or pray for acceptance or whatever. But there was nothing I could do. And that is so scary. That can often feel helpless almost. And that's why I've shied away from really tuning into that frequency because it's scary, right? But the point that I'm trying to emphasize here, not to scare you guys into thinking I'm into some voodoo, or for people to pay me for consultations. The point is, I was able to tune into those frequencies when my time was my own, or my thoughts were my own. I wasn't spending my time thinking about other people's thoughts or other people's influences in what I was thinking about. You know what I mean? I could just sit and be, and my brain wasn't busy working overtime trying to process all this information that I'm being fed. Lately I've really been grounded. I've been doing yoga in Pilates in nature with my friend. I've been moving with intentionality. I've been deliberate about, putting my phone away. When I sleep, I sometimes leave it in the other room to make sure that there's no doom scrolling. When I'm tired and I feel like resting, I listen to my body instead of doom scrolling until I pass out, I've really been vocalizing my needs and desires and wants. When something doesn't feel right, I listen to that. And I think in the process, it's also fine-tuning some of these senses which aren't typically or aren't popular in current society. I was also thinking about the idea of our existence outside of the material condition in relation to romantic relationships, right? I've spoken a bit about my journey to finding the love of my life. And yes, the conversation I was having with my ex talking stage as well was in relation to this subject matter. I suppose I was wondering what it is that I'm getting wrong, because I've met incredible men. I've met, beautiful, accomplished, smart men that I would like to be partnered with. And I suppose to a certain extent, they also wished for the same. But where the challenge seems to be is that there appears to be dualities in my existence. And I don't see that as an issue because there's also dualities with them too. Often dualities that seem contradictory. You'd find men who are liberal in their value system, but will also uphold conservative values. And I suppose I've reconciled with the idea that, one person can be many things. We aren't a monolith as a people. I think it would be impossible for one to exist as just one thing. But somehow they find issue or haven't reconciled with my duality. It's almost as if when I embrace two seemingly conflicting ideas, it's threatening to them. And I think in part because as a society, we don't know what to do with conflicting ideas. And I think in male-female relationships, there's always an element of control. When you can control someone's belief system and almost with certainty that they are this, they are that, there's a level of predictability, a level of comfort because you know exactly what the outcome will be, to every action. Or you can almost predict with certainty that if you pull this lever, this is how they're going to act. But when you can't predict that, it's scary, it threatens the balance of power. Unpredictability is not a good thing to the social order. And so I think then their inability to exert control is not something that they can reconcile with. And unfortunately, I think I'm one who is very allergic to control. I don't think control and power can exist in an environment that is filled with love. I think the two are quite the opposite, and I think love cannot exist with control. There has to be a level of freedom there, level of free will as well, where you trust that someone's love for you is enough for them to choose, to choose you to act accordingly, or to act in a way that's righteous, or in line with one's desires as well. And guys, I know this sounds so theoretical. I don't even know if I'm gonna publish this episode, but this is what I think about all the time. You know what I mean? And I don't know, I'm just wondering, do you guys also think about these things? Am I just the odd one out, And the reason I'm thinking about this also, like, I was toying with the idea of, a polyamorous relationship then, because I think that would be the solution to these seemingly contradictory parts of myself, which I want to, to share with someone. I want all of me to be observed, if you get what I'm trying to say, or for someone to understand these facets, that make up me as a person, even though I don't yet have the language to express exactly what I mean by that. I think in friendship it works out so well because I've got so many different friends, and my friends, I love my friends, and my friends each play a very unique role in my life, I love them, but the way I love them is so different because they enrich my life in very different and unique ways. I had a friend who used to compare my friendship with hers to the friendship I had with Sma, for instance, and you'd be like, but why can't we do 1, 2, 3? Why can't, you post me like you do Sma or something? And I thought, honey, but you wouldn't understand that you play such a sacred role in my life. Like the kind of comfort and ease that I enjoyed with her was unlike any I've ever experienced with any of my friends. But unfortunately, when you compare, you end up trivializing the kind of connection you share with someone. And the friendship I've got with Sma is that of understanding, Sometimes I almost feel like he can read my mind, when I want to verbalize certain things that so many people misunderstand about me. He just gets. And it's so validating, to have that type of friendship. And there's different types of friends I've got. Each one of them plays such a unique role. So I could never say, I'm going to let go of so-and-so to only be friends with this other person. And maybe that's how I imagine, romantic partnership to be as well. Like maybe it's impossible to find all of that in one person. Like that understanding and exploration of my romantic self in one person is near impossible, especially when the men I've come into contact with seem to have difficulties with reconciling the many facets of me. I imagine then the solution is a polyamorous relationship. But also, I don't know any representations of a polyamorous relationship for a Black South African young woman. You know what I mean? Who lives in this society. I don't know any representations of that type of relationship that aren't taboo or like frowned upon or even weird. Like, I come from a very conservative background, like a Christian background. Yes, my mom comes from this long line of traditional healers, but she's since divorced that side of her and chosen to embrace it through the Christianity route. When she has visions, it's revelations. It's prophecy. When she can see what's yet to come, she's prophesying. So it's almost palatable, it's acceptable, because then it's through this Christian route. But if it was through the traditional healer route, which my other sister has chosen to embrace, it's a bit weird. It's witchcrafty, it's dirty, almost dark, and therefore unacceptable. So in the same breath, I can't imagine a polyamorous relationship set up that is still dignified, like that's still not a taboo. I don't know. Oh goodness. And that's why I think if I existed outside of this body, it wouldn't be a taboo. Like it wouldn't be such a grave limitation to be able to love on people and to experience people as they are, in their fullness, because there wouldn't be any physicality, right? I think it's the physicality of relationships that makes them immoral, that makes them taboo, and it's the physicality of gay relationships that people, lament or even condemn. There's even some churches that would talk about, yes, you can be gay. Maybe that's how God has made you. But as soon as you engage in sexual intercourse, then you are sinning. You know what I mean? And I think in the same breath that a gay relationship would be perceived in that manner, I think the physicality is what brings so much shame. If that part was removed, then I could just exist as I am. And this isn't to say that there's a physical attraction to like multiple partners or whatever. None of that. But I just think because the physicality is so limiting to how we experience people, I think it would be a freedom to experience relationships outside of our bodies, And we can't even fathom that because we can't imagine a world where the material substance didn't exist. We can't imagine a world where like we couldn't feel or touch or see or hear. Imagine if all of those senses were removed. What would that look like? I don't know. And so in relation to time, I think I was imagining what that existence would look like if time as a construct didn't exist, With a friend of mine I mentioned earlier, we were talking about the divine feminine or the divine consciousness, or ancient wisdom. I think this is also being spoken about in biblical terms, where that knowledge, ancient knowledge, exists. And it just requires our brains to be lucid or to be flexible enough to access that ancient wisdom, that divine consciousness, for us to see past the material substance in which we exist, but to almost live or access our subconscious or the spiritual being, or spiritual versions of ourselves. It's only then that we can actually access the divine consciousness. And I think thinking about it in that manner implies that it already exists. It's not something that is in the past. It's not this historical knowledge that exists in the past. It's available for us to access, provided that our brains are not cluttered by other people's, perceptions and views and ideas and thoughts. If they aren't filled by the propaganda and the constant input of information, then we can access the divine consciousness or this historical memory that exists in the universe all at once. You know what I mean? And yeah, that's what I've been thinking about. I don't know what the point of it all is, but I don't know. I just think it would be great if we could try and exercise detachment from the constant input of other people's thoughts and opinions and propaganda, being constantly fed information, so that we can listen to ourselves, listen to our own consciousness, our own divine consciousness, the universe divine consciousness, or God, as we sometimes explain it. So if we declutter ourselves from all this propaganda that's meant to make us toe the line, for us to be compliant, to not question, to just be, compliant citizens. If we can detach from all of that, I imagine what beautiful secrets of the universe we could unveil, What other human experience might we have outside of our bodies, Yeah, and I think this is a very rebellious way of thinking. So I won't even say a soft rebellion, but I don't know, Chamis. Think about what that would actually look like. I don't know. I feel like it would be a kind of freedom, if you will, to be able to exist outside of these limitations that we find ourselves in. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in. This was a very long episode of my rambling at 11 o'clock at night. But yeah, I've really been thinking about this, and I'm so glad I've finally put it to thought or in words. And I know it's not as logical or as, lucid as I would like it to be. Perhaps I should put it in writing and I could decipher my thoughts a bit better, and there would be a so what at the end of, all my ramblings. But I hope it gives you something to think about. At the very least, I hope it encourages you to be so stingy about your time, so stingy about yourself, about your thoughts, and your experiences as a human, to not freely give that mindlessly through doom scrolling or through internalizing other people's ideas as your own, by resisting the external influence that's meant to keep us compliant in the system. This very system that we complain about, that is also reason for, our oppression as women, as various minority groups. I can mention various groups that are marginalized. But if we entertain the ideas of people who are beneficiaries of the system, then we risk being stuck in this matrix, being stuck in this loop, feeling helpless, but not doing anything to change the circumstances. So my invitation to open yourselves up for your own thoughts, or to receive ancient wisdom, isn't so that we can live in the clouds, and be in this airy-fairy state that immobilizes us into inaction. But it's so that you can construct your own ideas of what it means to be alive, and how you want that expression in reality, what you want that to look like, as opposed to internalizing someone else's version of what life should look like for you, So, yeah, Chumis, thank you so much for joining me again. Please have a good night and enjoy the rest of your evening. I will see you at the next episode. Bye.